6 weeks. Every night, a black car pulled up in front of her restaurant. No one came out. No one knocked. Only cold eyes followed her every step in the darkness. Noelle Mercer thought she had escaped that world forever. The world of guns, betrayal, and the man she once loved more than life itself. But tonight, when strangers appeared at her son's school gate, she understood. Nothing truly ends. And that man in the shadows, he wasn't her only enemy. Click like and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. Watch until the end, because nothing here ends the way you think. The walk home never changed. That was the thing about routine. It lied to you. It whispered that because something happened the same way 100 times, it would happen that way 100 more. Noelle Mercer believed that lie. She'd built her entire life around it. 11:17 p.m. The last busboy had clocked out 40 minutes ago, and Noelle stood alone behind the bar, counting the till with the practiced speed of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. The restaurant smelled like garlic butter and spilled Malbec and the particular exhaustion that settled into wood floors after 12 hours of foot traffic. She liked it. That smell meant another day survived, another shift completed, another deposit that might, just barely, cover the walk-in refrigerator repair she'd been putting off since March. She locked the drawer and pulled on her coat. Outside, the harbor was doing what Boston harbors do in October, throwing cold off the water like it had a grudge. Noelle tucked her chin into her collar and walked. Her boots on the cobblestone made a sound like someone counting seconds. Her apartment was 11 minutes away. She'd timed it once and then never bothered again because it was always 11 minutes and nothing ever changed on this block after midnight. Except the car. She didn't notice it at first. People parked on Brant Street all the time. Delivery trucks, Ubers waiting on fares, couples who needed somewhere quiet to argue. A black sedan, late model, clean in a way that felt deliberate. She walked past it the first night without a second glance. The second night, she noticed the engine wasn't running. Someone was inside. She could see the faint outline of a figure in the driver's seat, backlit by the distant glow of the harbor lights. She slowed for half a step, then kept moving. Boston. People sat in cars. It wasn't a crime. By the third week, she had a theory. It was probably some attorney working late calls or a detective on stakeout for the restaurant 2 doors down that everyone knew was laundering something. She never looked directly at the car. She walked past it the way you walk past homeless men asking for change when you've already given everything you have, with practiced apologetic blindness. 6 weeks in, she had stopped registering it at all. That was the thing about Noelle Mercer. She had learned through the particular schooling of a hard decade to stop seeing things that frightened her. The restaurant was called Tide and Salt, which her sous chef Marco said sounded like a laundry detergent, but which the food critics from the Globe had called an unpretentious jewel on the waterfront, and Noelle had kept the clipping in her desk drawer until the edges went soft. She was 34 years old. She had worked in restaurant kitchens since she was 19, had managed her first full front of house at 26, and had opened Tide and Salt on a loan that made her accountant physically wince when he read the terms. She was not a woman who did things carefully. She was a woman who did things completely. Her son Owen was 7. He had her dark hair and a gap between his front teeth and an unshakable conviction that dinosaurs were, in his word, the actual best. He stayed weeknights with her neighbor Linda, a retired school teacher with a soft spot for children who asked too many questions, while Noelle worked the dinner service. On weekends, Owen sat in the back office doing homework or drawing elaborate battle scenes between what appeared to be T-Rexes and what he described as bad guys in suits. Noelle didn't think too hard about the suits. She didn't think too hard about a lot of things. She had spent 8 years constructing a life held together by willful momentum and deliberate forgetting, and it had worked. It had worked fine. Some mornings she woke up and felt something close to peace. Those were the mornings that scared her most, because peace, in her experience, was always a waiting room. The call came on a Tuesday. She was mid-service, the dining room running at capacity, when Marco appeared at her elbow with the expression he reserved for things that were genuinely bad. Not spilled sauce bad, not 45-minute wait bad, but the face he made when the walk-in had failed overnight and they'd lost $400 of protein, tight around the jaw, eyes doing extra work. Linda called the restaurant line, he said quietly. Something about Owen's school. Noelle was already untying her apron. She called Linda from the back hallway, one hand flat against the exposed brick, and listened to the older woman's voice, which was working hard to stay calm and not quite making it. There had been a car outside the school this afternoon at pickup. 2 men. They hadn't done anything, hadn't approached Owen, hadn't spoken to anyone. But the school security guard had noticed them because they were watching the kids with a specific, unmoving attention, and the guard had gone outside to ask them to move along, and by the time he got to the sidewalk, the car was gone. Probably nothing, Linda said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. Was Owen upset? He didn't see them. He was arguing with his friend about whether a Spinosaurus could beat a megalodon. You know how he gets. Yeah. Noelle let out a breath. Yeah, I know. She stood in the hallway for another minute after she hung up. The kitchen noise washed over her. The clatter and hiss and shouted shorthand of a dinner service in full swing. Normal sounds. The sounds of the life she'd built. She went back to the floor and finished the service because there was nothing else to do, but something had shifted inside her chest. Some counterweight that had been perfectly balanced for years now, tilting a few degrees off center. That night, walking home, she looked at the black sedan. Really looked at it. It was angled slightly toward the restaurant entrance. The driver's window was cracked an inch despite the cold. The plates were Massachusetts registered, which meant nothing. She stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk 10 feet from the car and stared at the shape behind the glass. The shape didn't move. Noelle wasn't a woman who scared easily. She'd survived things that would have dismantled other people entirely. And what those things had left behind wasn't exactly courage. It was more like scar tissue, thick enough that fear had to work harder to get through. She walked to the car and knocked on the window. 3 seconds. 4. Then the glass slid down. The man inside was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that had clearly been handsome once and still carried the structure of it beneath something harder that had settled over the years. He was wearing a suit the color of anthracite, and he was looking at her with eyes that contained an expression she could not immediately name. Not surprise. He had known she was going to do this. He had been waiting for her to do this. What was in his eyes was something closer to grief. "Can I help you with something?" she said. "No," he said. "You've been parked here for 6 weeks." He didn't answer. He didn't look away either. "Are you watching my restaurant?" A beat. "I'm watching you walk home." She stared at him. Her heart was doing something complicated. "Excuse me?" "To make sure you get there." His voice was low and even, and he said it the way you state a fact, not the way you offer an explanation. That's all. Noelle felt the cold off the harbor more sharply then, felt it in her teeth. "I don't know you," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that he seemed to consciously shut down before it could fully form. "No," he said. "You don't." She took a step back. He didn't reach for her. He didn't say anything else. The window went back up, and Noelle stood on the sidewalk staring at her own reflection in the black glass until the cold got to be too much. And then she walked the rest of the way home faster than usual and locked the deadbolt and the chain and stood in her kitchen with her coat still on, breathing carefully. She didn't call the police. She thought about it and then didn't. She wasn't sure why. She asked Marco the next morning if he'd noticed the car. He had. He'd thought it was a plainclothes cop watching the late-night foot traffic near the bar 2 doors down. Noelle didn't tell him about the conversation. She drank her coffee and prepped the lunch service and told herself that a man watching her walk home wasn't necessarily sinister, that there were 100 explanations, none of which required her to excavate the parts of her history she'd buried under 8 years of relentless forward motion. She almost believed it. 2 days later, she picked Owen up from school herself. He came out of the building at 3:15 in a wave of second graders, spotted her immediately, and broke into the particular run of a 7-year-old who hasn't yet learned to contain his own enthusiasm, all knees and momentum, and no particular concern for the other kids in his path. He hit her at the hip, and she caught him and held on maybe a second longer than usual. "You smell like the restaurant," he said into her shoulder. "You smell like school," she said. "What does school smell like?" "Crayons and bad decisions." He pulled back to look at her. He had a smear of something blue across his cheekbone, a marker or paint, and his backpack was unzipped in the specific way that suggested several things had already fallen out of it at various points during the day. He was looking at her with the alert, slightly suspicious attention of a child who has learned to read his mother's moods. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm great," she said, and took his hand and didn't look at the street. The man's name came to her 3 nights later. She was behind the bar after close, doing inventory, when it surfaced from wherever she'd been keeping it. Not a memory exactly, more like a stone she'd been stepping around for so long she'd forgotten what it was. The way he'd said "that's all," the flatness of it, the lack of apology or explanation or any of the things people say when they're caught doing something they know looks wrong. She set down the bottle she was holding. Damien. She said it aloud in the empty restaurant, very quietly, like testing weight on a floor she wasn't sure would hold. Damien Viscari. The name tasted like 8 years ago, like a version of herself she had deliberately killed, like the phone call she'd gotten in the fall of her 25th year from a man she'd trusted completely, who had told her things about Damien that she had believed because they came with evidence. Photographs, recordings, a paper trail that she hadn't had the knowledge or the resources to question, and which had driven her out of Boston on a February morning with nothing but a duffel bag and the specific stunned calm of someone who has been hit hard enough that the pain hasn't reached them yet. She had built everything she had now on the other side of that exit. Owen, the restaurant, the 11-minute walk home. All of it. She put the bottle back on the shelf and went to her office and sat down and put her head in her hands and breathed through her nose until her pulse dropped back to something manageable. She didn't know what it meant that he was out there. She knew it meant something. She didn't go to the car the next night, or the night after. She watched from the restaurant window as she locked up and confirmed, each time, that the sedan was there. And then she turned off the lights and left through the back entrance and took a longer route home. On the 4th night, the sedan wasn't there. She stood on the sidewalk looking at the empty parking space and felt something she didn't want to examine, some complicated alloy of relief and a thing that lived adjacent to loss. She told herself it was only relief. She was good at telling herself things. Friday was Owen's school fall showcase, the event where second graders performed a 12-minute pageant about Massachusetts history that was more or less completely incoherent but deeply earnest. Owen had a speaking part, 6 lines about the fishing industry delivered with the confidence of a much older child, and the loud, unself-conscious diction he applied to everything. Linda sat beside Noelle in the folding chairs and gripped her arm during Owen's part with the pride of a woman who had helped him rehearse those 6 lines approximately 47 times. Afterward, in the school gymnasium with bad punch and store-bought cookies, Owen introduced her to his teacher and his best friend Marcus and Marcus's parents, and Noelle stood in the yellow light of the gymnasium, feeling something crack open in her chest that she usually kept sealed, just the plain, unguarded warmth of a moment that belonged entirely to the life she'd made. No shadows in it, nothing borrowed or incomplete. She held on to that feeling on the drive home, fed it carefully. She was turning off the ignition outside her building when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Ms. Mercer?" The voice was not Damien's. Male, accented faintly with something she couldn't place. Eastern European, maybe, or somewhere in that latitude. Very calm, the calm of someone who has no reason to rush. "We need to speak about your son." She went very still. "I don't know who you are," she said. "That's quite all right. You will." A pause. "Owen is a remarkable child. His father's eyes, from what I understand." Her hand tightened on the phone until the case creaked. "You don't know anything about his father." "We know considerably more than you do," the voice said pleasantly. "That's rather the point. Owen Viscari, and we will be using that name shortly, whatever you'd prefer, represents a significant inheritance. I think you understand on some level what that means." "Don't call this number again," she said, and hung up, and sat in the dark of her car for 40 seconds with her eyes closed and her whole body running a fear that felt ancient and specific, a fear she'd spent 8 years learning to silence. Viscari. He'd said Viscari. She'd never told anyone who Owen's father was. Not Linda, not Marco. Not a single person alive, as far as she knew, had that information. As far as she knew. She got out of the car and went inside and checked on Owen, who was asleep with a dinosaur book open across his chest, and she stood in the doorway of his room and watched him breathe for a long moment before she went to her own bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and tried to think clearly. She couldn't think clearly. She picked up her phone and stared at the screen, trying to work out what came next. Who you called when the thing you'd spent 8 years running from had learned your son's name? The answer that kept surfacing was the one she didn't want. She put the phone down, picked it up again. Put it down. She told herself she would figure it out in the morning, that tonight she'd sleep, and in the morning the path forward would be clearer. She had done that before, gone to sleep inside a problem and woken up on the other side of it. She was good at that, at surviving forward. She was still telling herself this at 2 a.m. when she heard the sound. Not loud, not dramatic. A soft, almost careful sound from the direction of the street below. A displacement of air, a presence. The particular silence that follows something trying hard not to make noise. Noelle went to the window. Below, on the dark street, 2 men stood outside her building. They weren't looking up. They didn't have to. And then, from the opposite end of the block, moving fast and completely without sound, a third figure appeared, taller than the other 2, moving with the purposeful economy of someone who has been in this situation before and has long since run out of hesitation about what it requires. The sedan was parked at the corner. Noelle pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. She knew the shape of that walk. She had spent 8 years trying to forget it. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Unknown number. She answered before the second vibration. "Don't turn on any lights," Damien Viscari said. "Get Owen. Take only what's immediately necessary. You have 4 minutes before those 2 men reach your floor, and I can only delay them so long." A beat. A half second of something that wasn't quite silence. "I know you don't trust me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust that those men outside did not come here to talk." Noelle was already moving. She grabbed Owen first. That was instinct. Not thought, not calculation, just the animal certainty of a mother whose body had already processed the danger before her mind caught up. She crossed the hall in 4 steps and pushed his door open and scooped him off the mattress before he was fully awake, dinosaur book tumbling to the floor, and he made the confused sound of a child pulled too fast from deep sleep. A small, wordless protest that broke something in her chest even as she was already moving. "Mom!" Shh. Arms around my neck. "What's Owen?" Her voice was low and flat, and he heard something in it he'd never heard before, because he went quiet immediately and did exactly what she said. She grabbed her go bag from the closet shelf. An old habit from a life she'd told herself was dead, a habit she'd never quite managed to kill, and her phone and her keys, and that was it. She didn't take anything else. She didn't look around the apartment. She had 11 minutes of it memorized anyway. The stairwell was the question. Elevator was obviously finished. Too slow, too loud, too much of a box. She cracked the apartment door and listened. The building had 4 floors. She was on the 3rd. The 2 men below would take the stairs, not because they were cautious, but because men like that always took the stairs. Elevators were where ambushes happened, and men in their profession had learned that early or not at all. She went up. Owen pressed his face against her shoulder and didn't ask anything else. He was 7 years old and he was terrified, and he had the particular intelligence of a child raised by a woman who never panicked visibly, which meant he was watching her for information instead of demanding it. She loved him so much in that moment, it was almost physically painful. The roof access door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. She had noticed that on her 3rd week in the building and had never mentioned it to the landlord, and right now that oversight was the most valuable thing she owned. Cold hit them both when she pushed through. The full, undiluted cold of an October night off the harbor, and Owen made a small, sharp sound and pressed harder into her coat. Noelle crossed the tar paper to the far edge and looked down. Damien was directly below, on the street, moving the two men in a direction that was not toward the building's entrance. She couldn't see clearly. The roof edge, the dark, the distance, but she could see that the dynamic had shifted, that whatever Damien had done or said had bought minutes, if not more. She sent a text to the number that had just called her. Roof. 40 seconds later, the roof access door behind her opened and Damien Vescari came through it like he'd used this specific door 100 times, which, she would later understand, he essentially had. He stopped when he saw Owen. It was brief, a fraction of a second, the duration of a single breath, and then it was gone, replaced by the same controlled stillness she remembered from the window of the sedan. But she'd seen it. She'd seen the thing that moved through his face when he registered the child in her arms, and she filed it away in the part of her brain that was going to need to deal with all of this later, when later was an option. Car's on the north side, he said. We go down the fire escape on your left, cross the alley, you'll see a gray Volvo. Keys are in it. Where are those two men? Occupied. He was already moving toward the fire escape. For approximately 3 minutes. And after 3 minutes? We're not here after 3 minutes. He looked back at her. Can you manage the ladder with him? She gave him a look that she hoped communicated concisely what she thought of that question. They went down the fire escape with Owen clinging to her back, his arms locked around her neck, not making a sound. Her boots rang on the metal steps. The alley below was empty and smelled like wet concrete and old garbage, and she hit the bottom and crossed it without breaking stride, found the gray Volvo exactly where he'd said, got Owen into the back seat and climbed in after him. Damien was already in the driver's seat. The engine was running before she'd closed the door. They pulled out of the alley and turned north, and Boston fell away behind them in the dark. Owen fell back asleep somewhere around Revere. Children could do that, the body overriding the brain, insisting on its own maintenance regardless of circumstance. Noel looked at him in the back seat with his head against the window and his mouth slightly open, and felt the particular vertigo of watching your child be innocent in a situation that had nothing innocent in it. She turned to face forward. Talk, she said. Damien had both hands on the wheel. He was driving at a precise speed, not fast enough to flag attention, not slow enough to feel careful. He'd been doing this long enough that caution had become reflex. What do you want to know first? Who were those men? Corlano family, out of Providence. A pause. They've been building toward this for about 3 weeks. I've been managing the approaches, but tonight they moved faster than I anticipated. You've been managing approaches. She kept her voice low because of Owen, and the effort of keeping it low made it come out very controlled and very cold. Approaches to my apartment. Yes. To my son. Yes. She turned to look at him then, full profile, the set of his jaw, the quality of attention he was putting into the road. How long have you known about Owen? A silence that ran about 4 seconds too long. Damien. 14 months. She absorbed that, let it sit, counted something in her head that wasn't exactly seconds. 14 months, she said. And you chose to, what? Watch me walk home. I chose not to blow up your life. He said it without any particular emotion, which somehow made it worse. You'd built something, you were... He stopped, chose different words. Owen was safe, you were safe, I wasn't going to... Don't, I... The word came out sharp enough that she saw his jaw tighten. Do not tell me what you decided I deserved. That's not yours to decide. He didn't answer. How did they find out? She said. Records. His hands shifted on the wheel. There was a leak inside my organization. Someone sold a document trail that included paternity information I'd sourced independently. You did a paternity test. I needed to know if he was mine. He has a name. I know his name. And the way he said it, very quiet, not defensive, just factual, told her that he'd been saying Owen's name for 14 months in context she wasn't present for, and something about that understanding moved through her like a current she didn't want to feel. The Corlano family, she said. What do they want with him? Leverage. I've been in a territorial dispute with them for the better part of a year. They've been losing, and they know it. His voice didn't change register. Pure information. An heir complicates my succession in ways that make Owen tactically valuable to them. They're not interested in him as a child. They're interested in what he represents. Noelle pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. She did it to stop herself from saying the first 4 things that came to her mind, all of which were variations on "this is your fault," and none of which would help Owen sleep through the next several hours. "Where are we going?" she said. "Safe house in Gloucester. We'll reassess at daybreak." "We." "Yes." She looked at him again. He was still watching the road. "I'm not—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Damien, I am not doing this with you. I'll take Owen and go where?" Not a question, a geography lesson. They have your address, your restaurant, Linda's address, the school. They have your car plates. They had a man on your building for 9 days before tonight, which means they know your patterns better than most people in your life do. He checked the mirror. "You can be angry at me about all of the rest of it. That's fair. But right now, I'm the only available option." She wanted to argue with that. She worked at it for a full mile and couldn't find the structural weakness. "Fine," she said. "But we're not done." "I know," he said. But the safe house in Gloucester was a shingled colonial 3 blocks from the water, the kind of house that looked like it had been owned by the same family for 50 years and had gradually stopped being maintained with any urgency. Inside it was clean, functional, and completely anonymous. The furniture chosen for utility rather than personality, the shelves empty of anything that would tell you who'd been here before. Owen woke up when the car stopped and looked around with the slow, processing blink of a child trying to locate himself in physical space. "Where are we?" "A house near the ocean," Noelle said. He considered this. "Whose house?" "A friend's," she said, and felt Damien behind her go very still. Owen accepted this with the pragmatism of a 7-year-old who has learned that adults sometimes do inexplicable things, and the best strategy is to identify the food situation. "Is there anything to eat?" "I didn't have dinner." "You had dinner," Noelle said. "You had the showcase cookies." "Those weren't dinner. Those were an emotional experience." He climbed out of the car and stood on the gravel drive and looked at the house with what appeared to be cautious optimism. Noelle looked at Damien. Damien was looking at Owen with an expression she genuinely could not categorize. "Kitchen stocked," he said without moving his gaze. "Cereal, bread, eggs, whatever he wants." She put Owen on the couch with a bowl of cereal and a blanket she found in the hall closet, and the promise of a full explanation in the morning, which he accepted with slightly more suspicion than she'd have preferred. He was asleep again in 11 minutes, the specific, instantaneous sleep of a child who has decided to trust that his mother has the situation managed. She went to the kitchen. Damien was at the counter with a phone, running something she couldn't see. She put both hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at him until he put the phone down. "Start from the beginning," she said. He turned around. He looked tired. Not physically, or not only physically, but the way people look tired when they've been holding something heavy for a very long time and have gotten proficient enough at holding it that it no longer shows until they put it down. "You got a call," he said. "In February, 8 years ago, from a man named Calder Voss." Her stomach moved. "Calder told me. Calder told you that I'd ordered the killing of your brother's associate in New Haven, that I'd been using your family's connections to launder money through their construction business, that I was going to absorb the operation and cut your family out, and that when they pushed back, I'd have them handled. He said it the way you recite something you've had memorized for a long time. He gave you photographs, phone records, wire transfer documents." Noelle's jaw was tight. "Yes." "All of it fabricated. The photographs were composited. The phone records were his own, with my name attached. The wire transfers ran through an account he'd opened in my name 18 months before he ever brought them to you." He leaned back against the counter. Not comfortable, anchored. "I spent 2 years after you left trying to figure out where you'd gone, and another 6 months figuring out why you'd left. By the time I had the full picture of what Calder had done, you'd been gone from Boston 3 years. She stared at him. "Why would Calder?" "Because he wanted the organization. Flat. He'd been my lieutenant for 7 years. He knew the operation better than anyone alive. He also knew that as long as you were in my life, I was..." He stopped, chose. Reachable. That I made decisions based on things other than pure calculation. Calder doesn't like variables. He wanted control, and he wanted me operating without anything that looked like a weakness. His eyes held hers. You were not a weakness. You were the only thing I had that wasn't about blood and territory. He understood that better than I did. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the wind was doing something to the windows. Where is he now? She said. Still in the organization, third in command. The stillness in his face went a degree colder. Because I needed him there until I had enough to end this correctly. Taking him out without the full case built would have fractured the whole structure. He stopped again. This wasn't evasion. He was choosing precision over speed. I've been building toward that for 2 years. And now? Now the Corlanos have accelerated everything by going after Owen, which means the timeline collapsed. He picked up the phone again. Calder almost certainly knows the Corlanos moved tonight. He'll be watching to see how I respond. If he thinks Owen compromises me, he might decide the Corlanos' approach is actually useful to him. Noelle sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, not because she needed to, because her body made an executive decision. You've been carrying all of this, she said. Yes. For 8 years. For 8 years. She looked at the table, looked at her hands on the table. The restaurant, she said. The investors. A silence. Damien. Anonymous LLC. Legitimate capital. Clean trail. You never would have been able to trace it back. He said it without apology, which was almost worse than an apology would have been, because it meant he'd made the decision and lived with it and would make it again. You were going to lose the building in your second year, the refrigeration system, and then the roof, and then the health inspection. You were 6 weeks from closing. That was my restaurant to lose. I know. I built that. That was... She stopped. Her voice had developed an edge she was fighting to control. You don't get to decide what I need. You don't... That's not... I know, he said again. Quieter. And then, after a beat, in a voice that had shed whatever professional layer he'd been maintaining, I know, Noelle. She closed her eyes, opened them. How many people want Owen right now? Back to business. He accepted the pivot without comment. The Corlanos, actively. Calder, potentially. There are 2 other families watching the situation, but they won't move without seeing how it resolves. They don't want to expose themselves to a losing position. So it's manageable if we handle Corlano. More or less. And Calder. Calder is not manageable by any definition that doesn't end with him. He cut himself off. I'm not fragile, she said. He looked at her. I know that too. She sat in the kitchen for another 30 seconds and then stood up. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to sleep because my son is asleep. And he's going to wake up with questions, and I need to be functional enough to give him something that isn't the full truth, but isn't a complete lie either, because he's smart and he'll know the difference. She pushed the chair back. In the morning, you're going to tell me everything. Not the curated version, not the version where you decide what I can handle. Everything. All right. And then we're going to figure out how to end this. He held her gaze. Something moved through it, complicated, layered, the kind of thing that required more vocabulary than either of them had available at 1 a.m. All right, he said again. She left him in the kitchen. Done. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark of the bedroom with the door cracked so she could hear Owen's breathing from the couch, and she stared at the ceiling, and she did what she'd spent 8 years carefully not doing. She thought about what it had felt like to be 25, and in love with a man who existed in a world she understood was dangerous, but had let herself believe she could somehow be outside of, could be the still point at the center of. She thought about the morning she'd answered the phone, and Calder Voss's voice had been in her ear, so calm, so specifically regretful, laying out everything, the evidence, the timeline, the conclusion she was supposed to reach, how she had sat on the edge of her bed for 4 hours before she could move, how she had packed without crying because she'd already cried at some point during those 4 hours and hadn't noticed, how she had never once in 8 years considered that the evidence might have been engineered, Because when you're 25 and you've been handed a complete story, packaged and sourced, and delivered with the kind of detail that authentic knowledge produces, you don't interrogate the package. You just believe it and break. She thought about Owen sleeping in the next room with Damien's eyes in his face, something she'd been not thinking about for 7 years with a discipline that had required enormous ongoing effort. She thought about a man sitting in a parked car for 6 weeks to make sure she got home safely. She didn't sleep. Owen woke at 6:47 with the automatic precision of a child whose body had decided that sleep was finished and further negotiations were closed. Noelle heard him stir and was in the doorway before he was fully upright. He looked around the unfamiliar room, looked at her, looked at the window where gray October light was coming through. "You need to explain some things," he said. "I know. The ocean thing was true. I can hear it." He pulled the blanket tighter. "Who's the man in the kitchen?" Noelle went still. "You saw him?" "I got up to go to the bathroom. He was at the table with a lot of phones." Owen regarded her with the unblinking assessment of a child who has decided to hold off on panic until he has more information. He looked up, and then he looked away really fast, like he didn't want me to see him looking. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the couch beside him. He leaned into her shoulder automatically, the way he'd done since he was small enough that the gesture had made structural sense. "His name is Damien," she said. She stopped, started again. "He's someone I knew a long time ago, before you were born. He's helping us right now because some people, bad people, found out about us, and we needed to go somewhere safe." Owen was quiet for a moment, processing. "Bad people like how?" "Like people who make very bad choices for money." He thought about this. "Is he a bad person?" She opened her mouth and found the question harder than it should have been. Not because the answer was no, or at least was not simply yes, but because the full answer required a framework she didn't have language for, especially at 6:47 in the morning in a borrowed house with salt wind coming off the water. "He's complicated," she said. Owen absorbed this with surprising equanimity. "Marcus's dad is complicated. His mom says he's a work in progress." Something like that. "Okay." He settled against her. "Is there more cereal?" Pin. Damien was still at the kitchen table when they came in, and he'd made coffee. Real coffee, not the pod machine kind, and set out a bowl and spoon without being asked, which meant he'd heard Owen waking up and had moved to make it easier in the smallest practical way available to him. Owen sat down at the table across from Damien with the directness of a 7-year-old who doesn't yet have the social programming that makes adults avoid eye contact in uncomfortable situations. "Hi," Owen said. "Hi," Damien said. "I'm Owen." "I know." And then something happened on Damien's face that Noelle had to look away from because it was too raw and too private, and watching it felt like reading someone's mail. "Do you have a dog?" Owen asked. "No. We can't have one either because of the restaurant hours." Owen poured cereal into his bowl. "I've been making a case for a fish, but my mom says fish are just wet plants." "That's not what I said," Noelle said, pouring coffee. "It's what you meant." Damien looked at the table. He might have almost smiled. It was difficult to tell because it was the expression of a man who had apparently been rationing whatever warmth he possessed for a very long time and had forgotten the natural motion of it. Noelle set a mug in front of him without comment. He looked up at her. She looked away. The call came at 9:14. Damien's phone, the main one, the one with the encrypted line, lit up with a number that made something in his posture change in a way Noelle caught immediately. He looked at the screen and then at Noelle and said quietly, "I need to take this." He stepped outside. Through the kitchen window, she watched him on the porch, his back to the glass, and she watched the way he stood go from contained to something harder. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. He came back inside 3 minutes later, and the kitchen felt about 4 degrees colder. "Calder made contact with the Corlano family last night," he said. "Directly. He's offering them a deal. Information on Owen's location in exchange for removal of specific members of my security detail." He set the phone on the table. "He's moving faster than I built for." Noel looked at him. He knows where we are? Not yet, but if he's sharing intelligence with Corlano, we have a window of maybe... He checked his watch. 18 hours before our position here becomes a liability. Owen was still at the table, very deliberately paying attention to his cereal in the way children pay attention to cereal when they are listening to everything. Owen, Noel said, go pick a room and see if there are any books, okay? He looked at her, looked at Damien, picked up his bowl and left without argument, which told her he understood more than he was saying. She waited until she heard his footsteps stop in the hallway. What do you need to do? She said. Damien looked at her. The question had apparently surprised him. Not its existence, but its shape. The fact that it was, what do you need, rather than what are you going to do to us? I need to get ahead of Calder before he finishes the deal with Corlano. If those two forces align, it becomes a containment problem I can't manage from a safe house in Gloucester. He paused. I need to reach 2 people in my network who Calder doesn't know I trust, which means I need to use a line he doesn't know I have. Do it, she said. Noel, I said do it. She pulled her coffee toward her. You told me to trust that those men outside didn't come to talk. You were right. So, do what you need to do and tell me what I need to know, and let's figure out how to get Owen to the other side of this. He studied her for a moment with the specific attention of someone recalibrating a calculation that had been running on old data. Then he picked up the phone. The next 6 hours ran like managed chaos, the kind that looks, from the outside, like stillness, but is actually every available resource being coordinated at speed. Damien worked 3 phones in rotation. 2 men arrived at the house by midday, introduced only as Reyes and Solt, moving with the quiet competence of people for whom personal information was a professional hazard. They swept the perimeter, confirmed the route north, and spoke to Damien in half-sentences that Noel didn't try to parse. She kept Owen occupied. Books, a deck of cards she found in a kitchen drawer, a long conversation about whether a Therizinosaurus could defeat a Triceratops that she participated in more fully than she would have expected given the circumstances. Owen played cards with a focus that was only partially about cards. At 2 in the afternoon, he looked up from a hand of Go Fish and said, without preamble, Is Damien my dad? Noel set her cards face down on the table. What made you ask that? She said very carefully. Owen shrugged, the shrug of a 7-year-old who has been thinking about something for several hours and has decided the indirect approach is taking too long. He looks at me weird, like... He searched for it. Like he's trying not to look at me but also can't stop. She held his gaze, her son's gaze, with Damien's eyes in it, which she had been navigating for 7 years and which she suddenly could not pretend she didn't see. We'll talk about it tonight, she said. I promise. He looked at her for a long moment, assessing in the way he always assessed, with that quiet intelligence that had always felt like something inherited from a person she'd spent 8 years trying to unknow. Okay, he said, and picked up his cards. At 4:30, Damien came into the room where Noel was sitting alone, and she knew from his face before he opened his mouth that the calculation had changed. Calder knows we're in Gloucester, he said. She stood up. How? Solt thinks there's a tracker on one of the vehicles we used last night. We're checking now. His jaw was set in a way that was new. Not controlled, but controlled with effort. We need to move. Now. There's a property in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Compound. Defensible. I have people there I trust absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. She looked at him. You were wrong about Gloucester. You said 18 hours. I know. So when you say absolutely, I know. He held her gaze. I was wrong about the timeline. I'm not wrong about these people. She turned and went to get Owen. Whilst they were in the car, a different car, the gray Volvo abandoned in the drive, and moving north through the gray afternoon when Damien's encrypted phone lit up with a text he read and then set down on the console between them without speaking. Noel looked at it, looked at him. What does it say? He was quiet for a full 4 seconds. Calder didn't just sell Owen's location to the Corlanos, he said. He sold something else. A pause. He sold them the documentation proving Owen is my biological heir, authenticated copies, which means the Corlanos now have everything they need to file a claim on Owen's behalf against the Viscari succession structure. Legally, in the frameworks that govern these arrangements. His voice was perfectly level, which means this is no longer about leverage. It's about ownership. If they get Owen, they don't need to threaten me with him. They can use him to dismantle the entire organization from the inside with a legal foundation that would take me years to challenge. Noelle stared at the road ahead. They're going to use my 7-year-old son, she said, to take your empire. Yes. She let that land completely, felt the full weight of it. Then we can't just run, she said. No. We have to go back. Eventually. Yes. Not eventually. She turned to look at him, and her voice was the flattest and the most certain she'd heard it in 8 years. This ends. All of it. Calder, Corlano, the whole structure. We don't keep running, and we don't keep managing. We end it. A beat. Whatever that requires. Damien looked at her. In the back seat, Owen slept against the window with his mouth slightly open and his breath fogging the glass. You understand what that means, Damien said. I understand what it means for my son to spend the rest of his life being a bargaining chip, she said. That's what I'm not doing. Something shifted in Damien's expression. Not softening, but a kind of recognition. Like a man seeing, after a very long time, the person he had actually been looking. The sentence hung in the car like smoke. Damien didn't finish acknowledging it. He didn't need to. What Noelle had said, this ends, whatever that requires, had landed in the space between them and changed the atmospheric pressure of the entire vehicle, and they both felt it, and neither of them addressed it directly because addressing it directly would have required a vocabulary that 8 years of separation had made unavailable. He drove north. The White Mountains rose ahead of them in the failing afternoon light, dark and indifferent, the kind of geography that makes human problems feel correctly scaled. Owen slept. Noelle watched the road and said nothing and worked on keeping her breathing even, because her breathing was the one thing she could control right now, and control, even in its smallest forms, was the only thing standing between her and the specific terror of a parent who has understood completely that her child is a target, not leverage, not a threat, a target with legal documents attached. She thought about Owen at the kitchen table asking if Damien was his father with the directness of a child who doesn't yet know that some truths require staging before delivery. She thought about the way Damien had looked at the boy all day, not constantly, not obviously, but in the way you look at something you've been trying to prepare yourself for and found. When the moment came, that all the preparation was insufficient. She thought about 7 years of raising a child alone and deciding, very early, that the child's father was a story too complicated and too dangerous to tell, and that the kindest lie was no lie at all, just silence, structured carefully, maintained with the discipline of someone who understood that what children don't know can't hurt them. She had been wrong about that. Children don't know things until they do, and then the not knowing becomes its own kind of damage. The compound in the White Mountains was exactly what Damien had said, defensible, and nothing else he'd implied. It was not comfortable. It was a converted hunting lodge on 40 acres of private land with a chain-link perimeter and lights on motion sensors, and 4 men already stationed at intervals she clocked automatically as she got out of the car. The men were quiet and professional and looked at Damien with the specific deference of people who had been in difficult situations with him before and had arrived at the other side. One of them, older, with a gray beard and a stillness that read as long practice, came to the car and spoke to Damien in a low voice while Noelle got Owen out of the back seat. She heard the words Calder and 20 minutes ago in Providence, and then Damien said something back that she couldn't catch, and the older man's face did something complicated. Inside, the lodge smelled like wood fire and cold concrete, and the particular neutrality of a space maintained for function. Owen looked around with wide eyes, and the contained expression he used when he was deciding whether to be scared. This is like a cabin, he said. Exactly like a cabin, Noelle said. Is there a fireplace? There was. They put Owen in front of it with a wool blanket and a plate of crackers from a kitchen that was stocked with the efficient joylessness of emergency preparedness. And Noelle listened to him talk about the drive in the mountains and whether bears hibernated this early in October with one ear, while the other part of her brain tracked Damien's conversation with the older man, whose name, she gathered, was Parrish, in the adjacent room. She couldn't hear the specifics. She heard the tone. The tone was bad. Parrish left. Damien came into the room where she was sitting and looked at her and said, "I need to show you something." She followed him to a back room that had been converted into something between an office and a monitoring station. 2 laptops, a printer, a wall-mounted screen showing 4 exterior camera feeds. He sat at the table and opened one of the laptops and turned it toward her. On the screen was a document. Not a scan. An original high-resolution photograph of a physical page. The kind of photograph you take when you need to prove the object exists. The document had a header she recognized. It was a financial instrument, the kind used in property transfer, and the name at the top of it was the name of the LLC that had backed her restaurant's second-year capital infusion. She looked at it. "I see my investor," she said. "Keep reading." She read. The document was 3 pages. She scrolled through the photographs. And on the second page, buried in the signatory structure in the specific way that legal obfuscation buries things, was a name that did not belong to Damien. Calder Voss. She looked up. "He was a co-signatory on the LLC," Damien said. His voice was completely flat, the flatness of something that has been processed past the point of emotion into something colder. "I didn't know. The structure was set up by an attorney I trusted implicitly. Calder apparently got to the attorney 2 years before I set the fund up, built himself into the ownership structure at a level I couldn't see from my position in the chain." He closed the laptop. "He has a legal claim on 40% of Tide and Salt." The room was very quiet. "My restaurant," she said. "Yes." "He has a legal claim on my restaurant." "Yes." She sat back in her chair. Not because she was calm, because her body needed a moment to process the specific quality of this particular violation, which was different from the threat to Owen, different from the history with Damien, different in a way she couldn't immediately articulate, except that it hit the part of her that had built something, that had spent 8 years constructing a life out of nothing but her own relentless effort, and now that thing had been compromised from below, like a building whose foundation has been hollow the whole time and nobody told you. "He's been inside my life," she said. "For years. Yes. Without my knowing. Without either of us knowing." He said it with a specific weight, the weight of a man who has understood, in the last several hours, that the enemy he thought he knew had been operating at a depth he hadn't accounted for. "What else?" she said. "Because there's more. I can see it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the file beside the laptop and set a photograph on the table. She looked at it. It was a photograph of her apartment building, time-stamped. 8 weeks ago, 2 weeks before the sedan first appeared on Brant Street. In the photograph, 2 men were visible at the building's service entrance. One of them was unknown to her. The other one, in 3/4 profile, clearly captured by a camera he hadn't noticed, was a face she recognized. The attorney who had handled her restaurant lease. The one she'd used for her business incorporation. The one she had trusted because he'd been recommended by her accountant, who had been recommended by her bank, who had, she was now understanding, been recommended by an investor in her LLC she had never met in person. The chain went all the way down. "Calder built a perimeter around you," Damien said. "Not surveillance exactly, more like infrastructure. People in positions to give him information if he ever needed it. Your lease attorney, probably your accountant." He let that land. "He wasn't watching you because of Owen. He was watching you because you were the one variable he couldn't fully control. If you ever came back, if you ever found out the truth about why you left, you were the only person who could walk into a room of people who matter in this world and say what he did and be believed." She stared at the photograph. "He was protecting himself," she said. "He was protecting everything he took." She pushed the photograph away from her, not dramatically, just moved it to the edge of the table like clearing space to think. Her hands were steady. She noticed them being steady, and recognized that as the specific stillness that arrives on the other side of a certain kind of shock, not peace, not calm, but the body's emergency resource, the thing it brings out when feeling would be a liability. "What's his play now?" she said. "He knows I know about the Corlano deal. He'll know I've moved you. He's going to want to resolve this before I can build enough support within the organization to move against him." The door opened. Parrish came in fast, not running, but the walk that's faster than it looks, the walk of a man delivering information that has a time component. He looked at Damien and said 2 words. "Reyes is gone." The silence lasted approximately 1 second. "Gone how?" Damien said. "Phone's off. Car's still here. Solt checked the perimeter 20 minutes ago and found the south gate unlatched, from the inside." Parrish's voice was very controlled. "His bag is in his room. His weapon is on the table." Noelle watched Damien's face. She watched the sequence. Not panic. Nothing like panic, but a rapid internal reordering, like a man rearranging the contents of a room in his head to account for a piece of furniture he'd believed was fixed turning out to be mobile. "How long has he been with you?" she said. Damien looked at her. "Reyes," she said. "How long?" 4 years. "And he's Calder's." It wasn't a question. Damien's jaw moved. "He appears to be." She stood up. "Then Calder knows exactly where we are." "Yes." "How long do we have?" Parrish answered. "If Reyes contacted him when we arrived, 2 hours ago at most. Factor in response time, Corlano mobilization." He checked his watch. 40 minutes, maybe less. She was already moving toward the door. "Owen," she said. She came into the front room and Owen looked up from the fire with an expression that told her he had heard the tone of the last several minutes through the wall and had been sitting very still and deciding what to do with it. "We're leaving again," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He stood up and folded the blanket. He folded it carefully, deliberately, a 7-year-old imposing order on the small thing he could control. She watched him do it and felt something behind her sternum that she did not have time for. "Okay," he said. She took his hand. They made it 22 minutes. The cars came in from the North Access Road, not headlights blazing, not announcing themselves, but the kind of approach that announces itself anyway because silence at that hour on that road was its own kind of signal. Parrish's man on the north perimeter called it in, and they had 90 seconds to respond. Damien moved Owen to the interior room. No windows, concrete block on 3 sides. The architectural choice of someone who had built this space knowing, at some level, that this specific situation might occur. He moved the boy with a gentle, efficient speed that left no room for argument and no texture of fear, the way you move a child when you need them compliant without making them understand they should be terrified. Owen looked at him in the doorway of the interior room. "Stay low and stay quiet," Damien said, "regardless of what you hear." Owen looked at him, that direct assessing look, and said, "Are you going to protect my mom?" Something moved through Damien's face, raw and fast and real before he could manage it. "Yes," he said. Owen sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, which was exactly what staying low meant, and pulled his knees to his chest and did not make a sound. Damien closed the door. What followed was not a movie. Movies had a grammar for this. The choreography, the clean spatial logic of threat and response. What happened in the next 11 minutes had none of that. It had sound, the percussive wrongness of it, the way gunfire in an enclosed space removes all other sensory information and replaces it with a single flat physical fact. And it had motion, people moving through spaces too fast for the eye to fully track, and it had the smell of it, which was copper and smoke, and the particular sharp animal smell of adrenaline metabolizing in real time. Noelle stayed near Owen's door. That had been the arrangement. Parrish and his men on the perimeter and access points, Damien on the interior threshold, Noelle as the last line between whatever came through and the room with her son in it. She had a weapon. She hadn't held one in 8 years, and the weight of it was both familiar and strange, like a word in a language you used to speak fluently, and have been deliberately not speaking. She held it correctly. That was the thing about certain kinds of knowledge. It didn't leave, it just waited. The interior breach came through the east wall, which had looked solid and turned out to have a door she hadn't been shown. 3 men. The first one through encountered Damien, and that encounter was brief and loud, and then there were 2. One of them saw Noel. He was perhaps 30, dark jacket, the particular expression of a man performing a professional function that he does not find personally engaging. He started toward her, and she raised the weapon, and her hands were not shaking, which surprised her, and she said, "Don't." He didn't stop. She fired once. Center mass. The way she'd been taught by a man she'd spent 8 years trying to forget, in a context she'd spent 8 years trying to bury, and the body memory of it surfaced with a completeness that horrified her. Not the act itself, but the ease of it, the fact that it was still there, all of it, everything she'd worked to leave behind, intact and immediately available. The second man had turned when she fired, and Damien was there, and it was over. The exterior went quiet. Parrish's voice on the radio, accounting for people. Numbers that added up to containment. Noelle stood in the corridor with the weapon at her side and looked at what was on the floor and breathed through her nose until the sound of her own heartbeat stopped being the loudest thing in her head. Then she turned and opened Owen's door. He was exactly where she'd left him, back against the wall, knees to his chest. He looked up at her and his face was white and very still, the face of a child who has been alone in a dark room with loud, terrible sounds and has held himself together through the specific effort of absolute stillness. She crossed the room and got down on the floor beside him and put her arms around him, and he pressed his face against her shoulder and shook. Just shook, without sound, the full-body tremor of released fear. And she held him and said nothing because there was nothing to say that was remotely equal to what he'd just survived. Damien appeared in the doorway. He looked at the 2 of them on the floor and then looked at the middle distance, and his face did something she had no name for and didn't try to name. "Parrish secured the perimeter," he said. 6 of theirs. No casualties on our side. He paused. "One of the men they sent was Corlano's second son." She looked up. "They sent family. Which means this isn't tactical anymore." His voice was stripped of everything except information. "This is personal. Marco Corlano doesn't send his son on a retrieval operation. He sends him on a statement." He looked at Owen, at the boys shaking back, at Noelle's hand pressed flat and steady between his shoulder blades. Calder gave them something else, something that made this personal. She tightened her hold on Owen. "What?" "I don't know yet." "Find out." "Noelle." "Find out, Damien." Her voice was very quiet and very specific. "Because whatever he gave them, we need to know before we make the next move. And we are making a next move. Tonight." He looked at her for a moment. Then he left. She held Owen until he stopped shaking, which took longer than she wanted and shorter than she'd feared. When he finally pulled back and looked at her, his eyes were dry. Not because he hadn't been afraid, but because he'd metabolized the fear the way children sometimes do, into a kind of exhausted clarity. "That was really loud," he said. "I know." "Are those men going to come back?" "No." She meant it absolutely. "They're not coming back." He looked at her face and apparently found what he was looking for there, because he nodded and leaned back against the wall and let out a breath that was essentially his whole body going slack. "I'm really tired," he said. "I know. Can I sleep?" "Yes." She stayed on the floor beside him while he slid back into sleep with the animal efficiency of total exhaustion, and she watched him until his breathing went deep and regular, and then she sat in the dark and thought very clearly about several things. Damien was at the table with Parrish when she came back into the monitoring room, and the screen on the wall had more on it now, so documents, photographs, a map with markers. She looked at the map first because maps were concrete. "What did Calder give them?" she said. Parrish looked at Damien. Damien said, "Sit down." "Tell me." "Noelle." "Damien." "What did he give them?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Medical records." She stared at him. "Owen's medical records, specifically—" He stopped. chose words with the precision of a man who understands that some information, once landed, cannot be unlanded. A genetic workup from Owen's pediatrician. Standard panel done 18 months ago. A pause. Calder got to the records through your lease attorney's network. He had them analyzed. She was very still. Analyzed for what? The Vescari family has a hereditary condition, a cardiac anomaly, structural, manageable with monitoring and medication, but he stopped again. She felt it before he said it, felt the shape of where this sentence was going, like feeling the edge of a step in the dark. Owen has it, she said, a marker for it. Early stage. Asymptomatic. The pediatrician would have flagged it at his next physical. Nobody told me. The words came out flat. His doctor had this information, and nobody... The record was accessed and suppressed, Parrish said quietly. Calder's network pulled the file before the alert generated. The pediatrician never saw the flag. The room tilted slightly. Not physically, but something in her internal architecture gave way and then caught itself, and the process of that took several seconds she did not have to spare. Her son had a cardiac anomaly. And she hadn't known, because a man who had been quietly embedded in her life for years had suppressed the information and was now using it, using her child's body, her child's heart, as a piece in a game whose rules she had never been told. Marco Corlano's son, she said, when she trusted her voice. What does the cardiac record have to do with why it's personal? Damien's face was stone. Corlano lost a grandson 2 years ago. Cardiac event. Sudden. The family they have resources in cardiac research. Significant ones. Private clinics, the best specialists on the East Coast. He met her eyes. Calder told them Owen has the condition. He framed it as, he told them that with their resources they could treat the boy properly, that I wouldn't get him the care he needs. A beat. He gave Marco Corlano a reason to believe that taking Owen was humanitarian. Noelle sat down. Not because she wanted to, because her legs made the decision. She sat in the chair and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Her hands, which had held a weapon an hour ago with complete steadiness, which were not steady now, which were pressing hard against the table surface as if the table were the only fixed object in a room that had stopped being solid. He used my son's health, she said. Yes. To make a crime family believe they were rescuing him. Yes. From me. The word came out barely above a whisper. He made them believe Owen needed rescuing from his own mother. Damien said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. The information was what it was, and it sat in the room with all its weight, and there was no framing for it that made it lighter. She sat with it for 30 seconds. Let it be what it was. Then she raised her head. Owen needs a cardiologist, she said. I have someone. Best on the East Coast. She's not affiliated with anyone in this world. She's clean. She's... Set it up. I will. Tonight. Noelle, tonight we need to... Tonight. Her voice had found its floor again. Not the floor of 8 years ago, not the floor of a woman who was containing her fear until she could let it out later. A different floor. Lower. More certain. My son has a cardiac condition and he doesn't know it, and I am not spending another hour with that information unaddressed. Set it up, and then we deal with everything else. He pulled out a phone. And Damien. She waited until he looked at her. Calder. I want to understand everything. Every piece of what he built, every person he put in my life, every document he has and every play he has left. She held his gaze. I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding Owen in back rooms and waiting for the perimeter to hold. We need to take the case against Calder to every faction head he hasn't gotten to yet, and we need to do it before he can consolidate with Corlano. And I need you to understand that I am not asking permission, and I am not a thing you protect in a back room while the real work happens elsewhere. She leaned forward slightly. I know what he did to me. I'm the one who can prove it. First-hand witness, 8 years of documentation on my end. The investors, the lease, the financial trail in my restaurant. That's admissible in whatever court your world uses. Her jaw was set. Use me. He stared at her. Parrish, behind him, had the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he'd understood about the Parrish never finished recalibrating. There wasn't time. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on Damien's primary encrypted line. Not Calder, not Corlano, but a voice Damien hadn't heard in 3 years. A man named Stroud, who ran the neutral brokerage that the major East Coast families used for disputes that needed a third party without skin in the game. The kind of call that only happened when something had escalated past the point where anyone could pretend it was still manageable. Damien put it on speaker without being asked. Stroud's voice was dry and unhurried, the voice of a man whose professional utility depended entirely on never sounding rattled. Vescari, I'm reaching out because 3 families, Corlano, Marchetti, and the Drev Group out of Hartford, have formally requested a sit-down. Tomorrow night, the Harwick Terminal on the South Harbor. A pause. Calder Voss has filed a succession challenge on behalf of a coalition. The basis is your instability and, his word, your compromised decision-making regarding a civilian woman and an unverified heir. Damien's hand was flat on the table. Still. He's filed it formally, Damien said. Through proper channels, documented, witnessed. He has 3 signatories from within your own organization. Stroud paused again. If you don't appear at the sit-down, the challenge proceeds in absentia, which means it proceeds in his favor by default. What time tomorrow? 10 p.m. I'll be there. Stroud hung up. The line went quiet, and the room was very still for a moment, and then Noel said, He moved faster than even you thought. Yes. He's been building this for years. The succession challenge paperwork alone would have taken 18 months to prepare, minimum. Damien's jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle working. He had this ready. The Corlano approach, the documents on Owen, the challenge, it was all one operation, sequential. He looked at Parrish. He was waiting for me to make a move he could characterize as compromised, and I gave it to him. The sedan, Noel said, 6 weeks of surveilling a civilian woman, on record now, framed his way. He stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to both of them and looked at the dark tree line for several seconds. He'll have people at Harwick. The sit-down is the format, but the terminal is his choice of ground. He suggested it and the others agreed because they don't know it's his ground. Is it? He warehoused product through Harwick for 2 years. He knows every entry point, every blind spot, every acoustic. He stopped. Noel looked at Parrish. Parrish was looking at his boots. You're thinking about not going, she said. Damien turned around. I'm thinking about what going looks like. It looks like you walking into a building Calder controls with 3 families watching to see if you're stable enough to lead. She stood up. The chair scraped back. And it looks like me walking in with you. Both men looked at her. No, Damien said. I'm the witness, she said. You said it yourself. I'm the only person who can walk into a room of people who matter and say what Calder did and be believed. The succession challenge is built on your instability. The instability narrative requires that I'm a liability, a civilian woman who compromised your judgment. She held his gaze. So we walk in together, functional, coordinated, and I give them the financial documentation on the LLC, the lease structure, the 8-year deception, firsthand in the room, in front of every witness he brought to validate his challenge. A beat. You can't discredit testimony from someone who isn't there, but you can't ignore it when she's standing in front of you. Parrish made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She's right, he said to Damien, strategically. Owen stays here with Parrish and 4 people I trust with my life, she said. I've already had that conversation in my head, and I know how much it costs, and I'm paying it. Don't use my son as a reason to sideline me when sidelining me is exactly what Calder needs. Damien looked at her for a long time. The quality of the look had changed from what it had been 24 hours ago. Less contained, less managed. Something had been wearing through whatever surface he maintained, and what was underneath it was not softer exactly, but more present, more exposed to the specific temperature of this specific situation. You understand what the terminal is going to look like, he said. I understand what happened in that corridor an hour ago, she said. I'm not confused about the nature of this. He turned to Parrish. Get the cardiologist to Owen tonight, Dr. Reinhold. She'll come. He looked back at Noel. We leave for Boston at 7. We have until then to build the presentation. She sat back down at the table. Then let's build it, she said. Duh. They worked through the night. Not together exactly. Not in the way that 8 years ago they had worked together, which had been instinctive and overlapping and required very little translation. This was more deliberate, more careful. Two people who had been running separate operations on the same problem for a very long time, comparing notes for the first time and finding, in the comparison, the specific shock of all the things that would have been different if the notes had been shared earlier. Noelle had documentation she hadn't known was documentation. The investment records from the restaurant's second year, the LLC correspondence, the wire confirmations, the amendment filings she'd signed without reading closely because her accountant had told her they were standard. She had them photographed on her phone because she was the kind of woman who photographed important documents, a habit she'd developed in her mid-20s for reasons she'd stopped examining. Laid out on the table beside Damien's materials, the picture they formed was complete in a way that was almost architectural. Calder had not been sloppy. He had been the opposite of sloppy. He'd been meticulous, layered, patient in the way that people who plan to wait years before collecting on something are patient. The kind of patience that looks, from inside it, like loyalty. He was your most trusted person, she said, at some point around 3 a.m. Yes. For 7 years. Yes. She looked at a document, looked at his face. How does that feel? He was quiet. Then, like finding out the floor you've been standing on was never attached to anything. He turned a page. Like understanding that every good decision I thought I made in that time was being filtered, shaped. He had information I didn't have because he controlled what I had. I thought I was running the operation. I was running the version of it he let me see. That's what he did to me, she said, in one phone call. He looked up. He gave you a curated version of who I was, she said, evidence that fit a story he'd already written, and I believed it because I was 25 and I didn't have the framework to question a complete sourced narrative delivered by someone with no apparent motive to lie. She set down the document she was holding. He did it to both of us, just differently. You got 8 years of slow erosion. I got 1 morning of demolition. Something moved through his face. Not grief exactly, something more complex. The specific pain of understanding that what you lost and what someone else lost were the same thing, destroyed by the same hand, and that the destruction had been so thorough that you'd each spent years believing the other was the cause. Noelle, he said. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Not right now. We have 4 hours. He nodded and turned back to the documents. Dr. Reinhold arrived at 2:30 a.m. in a dark SUV with a medical bag and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had been called at unusual hours before and had made her peace with it. She was perhaps 50, small, with sharp eyes and the specific patience of a diagnostician. The patience of someone who has learned that rushing an assessment costs more than taking the time. She examined Owen in the back room while Noelle stood outside the door and felt the specific quality of helplessness that only exists when your child is behind a door and you're not. Parrish materialized beside her at some point with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for. He's going to be all right, Parrish said. Not reassurance exactly, statement of probability offered by a man who had spent decades assessing probabilities. You don't know that. No, he said. But Reinhold is the best there is, and the marker Calder flagged. I've seen her work with worse presentations than that and send people home in better shape than they arrived. She took the coffee. Dr. Reinhold came out 20 minutes later and said, with the directness of someone who does not believe in softening medical information unnecessarily, that Owen had a structural marker consistent with early-stage familial cardiac involvement, that it was asymptomatic and manageable, that with appropriate medication and monitoring his prognosis was excellent, and that whoever had suppressed the pediatric flag had caused a delay in treatment that she was going to need a full name for at some point because she had opinions about it. Noelle sat down in the hallway floor. Not dramatically. She just sat down because standing became briefly unavailable. Reinhold sat beside her, cross-legged, medical bag still in hand, with the ease of someone who has sat on many floors with many parents. He's going to be fine, she said. I want to see him monthly for the first year. After that, we reassess. The medication is straightforward. He'll complain about taking it until he's about 12 and then forget he ever objected. Noelle looked at her. Thank you. Thank whoever called me, Reinhold said. And whoever built this kid. He's sharp as hell. He asked me 3 diagnostic questions that most adults don't think to ask. She went back in to finish the paperwork. Noelle sat on the floor for another minute. Then she got up and went back to the table. At 6:45 a.m., Owen woke up and found his mother at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of documents, and the specific face of someone who has been awake all night and made their peace with it. He sat across from her. The doctor was nice, he said. She is. She said my heart has a thing. Noelle looked at him. She told you? I asked. He shrugged with one shoulder. She said it was like a software glitch. My heart works fine, but there's a line of code that needs patching. She said the medication is the patch. He considered this. I can live with the software metaphor. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. We should have known sooner. I should have. You didn't know, he said. 7 years old, and the matter-of-factness of it was absolute. You didn't know, so you couldn't tell me. That's different from not telling me when you knew. He looked at her steadily. Are you going somewhere today? For a little while. Parrish is going to stay with you. He looked toward the back of the house where Parrish was doing something in the kitchen, then back at her. And Damien? He's coming with me. Owen was quiet for a moment. Are you going to fix it? The bad people thing? Yes. Today? Yes. He turned her hand over and looked at her palm the way he'd done since he was very small, not reading it, just examining it, a habit she'd never questioned. Okay, he said. Come back. I will. That's not a question, he said. It's an instruction. She pulled him across the table into a hug that was probably tighter than he needed, and felt him pat her back with the pragmatic affection of a 7-year-old who accepts being hugged by his mother as one of the fixed conditions of his existence. The drive to Boston took 2 hours. She and Damien sat in the back of a black SUV driven by one of Parrish's men, with another vehicle in front and another behind. Convoy spacing. The mathematics of minimizing exposure on a road you haven't cleared. They went over it twice. The order of presentation, the documentation sequence, who would speak first, what ground they needed to establish before Calder had a chance to reframe the room. Damien knew the culture of these sit-downs the way she knew the rhythm of a dinner service. Intuitively, physically, the knowledge in his hands as much as his head. She knew her part. She'd been practicing it since 3 a.m. without meaning to, turning it over in her mind until the shape of it was smooth and certain. Witness testimony required a specific quality, not performance, not emotion, but the specific gravity of someone who is there and knows it, and is not asking you to believe them so much as presenting the fact of their presence as the thing that matters. She had been there, for all of it. Calder didn't have a counter to that. At some point in the second hour, Damien said without preamble, "The restaurant is yours. Whatever happens tonight, the LLC, the claim, all of it. I'll have it resolved. Clean title, no encumbrances." He looked at his hands. It was always supposed to be yours. She looked at the highway going under them. I know, she said. And then because it was true and because not saying true things had cost both of them enough. Thank you for the second year. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but I was 6 weeks from closing and she stopped. Thank you. He didn't answer, but something in the set of his shoulders changed slightly, like a wire that had been under tension for a very long time, releasing a fraction of its load. The Harwick terminal was on the South Harbor, a decommissioned shipping facility that had been in legal limbo for years, caught between a redevelopment deal that kept collapsing and a historical designation that kept blocking demolition. The result was a building that existed in a kind of permanent administrative nowhere, which made it, for certain purposes, extremely useful. They arrived at 9:40. The terminal was already lit from within, the high industrial lights that turned everything the color of old bone. 3 other vehicles in the lot. Men at the entrance who looked at Damien and stepped aside. Inside, the space was enormous and cold and smelled like salt and old diesel. Stacked containers ran the length of the east wall, In the center, under the direct fall of the overhead lights, a long table had been set up with chairs on both sides. The specific neutral furniture of a negotiation that both sides know isn't really neutral. At the table, Marco Corlano, 63, built like something that had started out as a man and been compressed, with the face of someone who had absorbed a great deal of damage over a long career and was still here. Beside him, two men Noelle didn't recognize. Across the table, two empty chairs for the Marchetti representatives who apparently hadn't arrived yet. At the far end, a neutral party she identified as Stroud from his voice, thin, gray-suited, with a stenographer's tablet. And standing near the east wall, with the ease of a man in his own space, Calder Voss. She'd seen photographs. Photographs hadn't been sufficient. He was perhaps 55, lean, with a face that had the quality of expensive maintenance. The kind of face that had been good-looking once and had been tended carefully enough to remain presentable into middle age. He was dressed well. He looked at Damien when they walked in with an expression of managed regret, the expression of a man who has prepared for this moment and decided that the most effective posture is sorrowful disappointment. His eyes moved to Noelle, and the managed regret became something else for half a second, something that had edges. Then it was gone. "Damien," he said. The voice was warm, the warmth of long practice. "I'm glad you came." "Calder," Damien said. The two men looked at each other across 30 feet of cold concrete, and the specific quality of that look, the duration of it, what it contained, was something Noelle felt in her back teeth. Marco Corlano stood. "Let's be direct. This is a procedural sit-down requested under charter. Calder Voss has filed a formal succession challenge, citing—" "I know what he filed," Damien said. "Then you know you're here to respond to it." Corlano sat back down. His eyes moved to Noelle. "Who is she?" "My name is Noelle Mercer," she said. "I'm here as a material witness to the events underlying the succession challenge. I have documentation." Corlano looked at Calder. Calder's face had done something, very briefly, that it then stopped doing. "Ms. Mercer is a civilian," he said pleasantly, "and whatever she believes she has—" "The LLC," Noelle said. She set the first document on the table. Clean movement, no performance. Marchmont Capital Partners, the investment vehicle used to finance my restaurant in its second year. I have the full origination documents, the amendment filings, and the signatory chain. She set the second document beside the first. Page 2 of the amendment filing, Calder Voss, co-signatory, 40% beneficial interest. He has been a silent partner in my restaurant for 6 years. I did not know this. I was not informed. This was executed under a fraudulent representation to my attorney. The room was quiet. Stroud was writing. Corlano was looking at the documents. "That's a civil matter," Calder said, still pleasant. "It has no bearing on—" "The phone records from February 8 years ago," Noelle continued. Third document. "These are mine. I kept them because I kept everything. The call came from a number registered to a holding company. I traced the holding company last night." She looked at Calder directly. "It traces to you." Something changed in Calder's face. Not much. Enough. "You called me," she said. "You told me Damien had ordered the death of my brother's associate. You gave me fabricated evidence. You drove me out of Boston." She held his gaze. "And you did it because I was the variable you couldn't control. Because as long as I was in Damien's life, he made decisions that weren't purely transactional. And you needed him transactional. You needed him controllable." She let that sit for 2 full seconds. That's in the succession challenge. His instability, his compromised judgment, the civilian woman who shouldn't be in his life. She set the last document on the table. "The civilian woman you put there, and then spent 8 years managing from the outside in case she ever came back." Marco Corlano picked up the phone record document, looked at it, looked at Calder. "Calder?" Corlano said. "These are fabricated," Calder said. The warmth was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. A foundation issue. The kind that doesn't show on the surface until the structure above starts to move. "She has every incentive to fabricate. The LLC filings aren't fabricated," Stroud said from the end of the table. Reading. "I'm looking at notarized originals. Then they're fraudulent notarizations. Calder." Damien's voice. Not raised, completely flat. Stop. The single word landed in the room with the weight of something that had been a long time building. Calder looked at him. I know about the attorney, Damien said. I know about Reyes. 4 years, Calder. You built him into my operation 4 years ago, and I didn't see it. I know about the Corlano approach timeline. I know you had the succession challenge documents prepared 18 months ago. He walked to the table and set down his own file. I know about the medical records you pulled from Owen's pediatrician and suppressed, and I know you gave Marco a humanitarian story about a sick child, so he'd send men to that school, and then to that apartment building, and then to the compound in the White Mountains. A sound from Marco Corlano. Low. Not a word. You used a 7-year-old's cardiac condition to manufacture a kidnapping with moral cover, Damien said. He looked at Marco. The boy is being treated. He's going to be fine, but your son went to that terminal in the White Mountains to take a child from his mother on the basis of a story this man told you about her being unable to provide adequate care. He let that land. Is that the operation you sanctioned? Marco Corlano was very still. The stillness of a man re-examining a sequence of events in real time and finding the re-examination deeply unpleasant. Antonio was told it was a retrieval, Marco said slowly, a welfare situation. Your son went in armed, Damien said, against a 7-year-old and his mother. I was told... Marco stopped, looked at Calder with an expression that had shed everything that wasn't cold fury. Marco. Calder's voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was something cleaner and colder and more honest. The voice of a man dropping a performance he no longer needs. The boy is Vescari's heir. Whatever the method, securing him was... You told me the mother was unfit, Corlano said. You told me the child had a condition she was ignoring. You told me it was a rescue. The strategic value. I sent my son, Marco Corlano said, very quietly. On a lie. The room held that. Calder looked around it, at Stroud, at the Marchetti seats now occupied by 2 men who had come in during the last minutes and were listening with the specific attention of people who are deciding which way to move, at Marco Corlano, whose face had become a geography of controlled building rage, at Noel, at Damien. He made a calculation. She could see him make it. This changes nothing about the structural question, he said. Damien's fitness to lead. The organization, Damien said, doesn't need to hear from you anymore. He said it very quietly, and the men at the entrance, 4 of them, Parrish's men, who had come in behind them and taken positions that now made geometric sense, shifted almost imperceptibly. Calder looked at the entrance, looked at Damien. You can't... I'm not doing anything, Damien said. Marco, the challenge was filed under your co-sponsorship. You have the documentation in front of you. You have Stroud as witness. What's your position on the challenge? Marco Corlano was still looking at Calder. The look had a specific temperature. Withdrawn, he said. Calder moved, not toward the exit, toward Noel. The calculation he'd made had landed on the only remaining leverage, and his body executed it before his face had finished deciding. And he crossed the distance fast, faster than a man his age should have been able to move, and his hand came out and Noel stepped into it instead of back. She stepped into it. Because 8 years ago, a 25-year-old version of herself had believed a voice on a phone and run, and she was not that woman anymore, and whatever Calder had expected from the civilian in the room, he had not expected her to step toward him, and the half-second of recalibration that required was enough. Damien reached him in that half-second. What happened after that was brief and thorough, and when it was finished, Calder Voss was on the concrete floor of the Harwick terminal with his wrists zip-tied, and the succession challenge documents scattered around him like the world's most incriminating confetti. And Damien was standing over him breathing hard through his nose, and Noelle was standing 4 feet away with her heart slamming against her ribs and her hands completely steady. Calder Voss. Boss, Stroud said from the end of the table, with the professional detachment of a man who has witnessed worse and documented all of it. I'm noting for the record that the succession challenge filed under your name has been withdrawn by co-sponsor Corlano, and that material evidence of fraud, falsification, and witness tampering has been entered into the record by 2 parties with standing. Calder said nothing. He was looking at the ceiling. Additionally, Stroud continued, I'm noting the presence of a primary civilian witness whose testimony has been given voluntarily and without... I have a question, Noel said. Stroud looked at her. The medical records he suppressed from Owen's pediatrician. She looked down at Calder. I need those restored, officially, through whatever channel makes them part of his legitimate medical file with no gaps, no questions, no legal shadow on the treatment history. She waited. Can that be done tonight? It can be done tonight, Stroud said. She looked at Damien. He was still breathing hard. There was a cut above his eyebrow she didn't remember seeing before, and his knuckles were wrong. He was looking at her with an expression that had, for once, no management in it whatsoever. Just the full, unguarded weight of a man who has been holding something for 8 years and has arrived, in this specific moment, at the place he built everything trying to reach. From the floor, Calder Voss made a sound. Not words. The sound of a man processing the complete failure of an 8-year architecture. The terminal was very cold. The harbor light came through the high windows and long gray bars. Marco Corlano was on his phone, voice low, and what she could hear of the conversation sounded like damage control and the specific fury of a man correcting a mistake made on the basis of bad information. Damien came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat off him, the physical fact of the night's exertion still metabolizing in his body, and he looked at Calder on the floor, and then at the door, and then at her. It's done, he said. Not yet, she said. He looked at her. Owen doesn't know, she said. Everything that happened tonight, the challenge, the documents, Calder, that's done. But Owen doesn't know who his father is, and I made him a promise before we left, and I intend to keep it. She held Damien's gaze. Tonight, when we get back. His jaw moved, something in his face that he didn't try to contain. Tonight, he said. She turned toward the door and stopped. Calder was looking at her from the floor, not with the controlled, warm effect he'd worn for the first part of the evening, with the face that was underneath that, older, harder, the face of someone who had spent decades making calculations, and had made one, tonight. Calder Voss looked at her from the floor with the face of a man who had run out of performances. That was what struck her most, in that last moment before she turned away. Not the fury, not the calculation, but the absence of those things. What was left underneath them was something almost ordinary. A man who had wanted something badly enough to spend a decade taking it apart piece by piece, and had arrived at the end of that project on a concrete floor with zip ties on his wrists and nothing left to show for it but the architecture of his own damage. She had expected to feel something larger, satisfaction, maybe, or the specific relief of a weight set down. What she felt instead was tired, profoundly, structurally tired, the kind that lives in bone. She turned and walked out of the Harwick terminal into the gray Boston morning and did not look back. Damien came out 2 minutes behind her. She was standing at the water's edge, the terminal backed against the harbor, and there was a concrete apron where the loading equipment had been removed, and beyond it the water, flat and pewter-colored in the early light, doing what Boston harbor water does in October, which is exist with a complete indifference to human events. He stood beside her. His knuckles were wrapped in a handkerchief someone had given him inside. The cut above his eyebrow had dried to a dark line. Stroud will file the record within the hour, he said. The challenge is gone. Corlano is... he paused. Marco is dealing with what he was told versus what actually happened. He'll come correct. His son, she said. Antonio is alive. He took 2 of Parrish's men with him when he cleared out of the White Mountains. He's going to need time before Marco sends him anywhere again. A pause. Marco understands now that his son went in on false information. That matters to him. She nodded. The water moved. A gull went over them, complaining about something. Calder, she said. He'll be handled through proper channels, within the structure. His voice was even. He filed formally. He'll be resolved formally. It'll take 3 weeks, and it will be thorough, and it will be final. She didn't ask what final meant. She knew what final meant. She had known for 24 hours what final meant, and had made her peace with it in the interior room of the White Mountains compound while Owen slept against the wall. Some costs could not be calculated in advance. You paid them when they came due, and you carried them afterward, and you did not pretend they were something other than what they were. The restaurant, she said. The LLC is being dissolved as of this morning. Marchmont Capital Partners ceases to exist before noon. Your accountant will receive documentation showing the investment was a full grant, no equity position, no co-ownership, no claims. He looked at the water. Your attorney, the lease one, he was compromised but not deeply. Calder used him as a conduit, not a conspirator. I'd suggest finding someone new regardless, but he's not a problem. And my accountant? Clean. Calder didn't need to touch him because the attorney was sufficient. He turned to look at her. Tied in salt as yours. Completely. It always was. The paperwork just needs to catch up to that fact. She breathed out slowly. The cold came off the water and she let it. I need to call Linda, she said. I haven't contacted her since Tuesday night. She's going to have called the police by now. Parish's people flagged it. She received a message that you'd had a family emergency and were unreachable temporarily. She's worried, but not. She hasn't filed anything. Noelle looked at him. You covered that too? Yes. She turned that over. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. She wasn't sure she had the bandwidth to determine how she felt about it right now, with the night still metabolizing in her body and her son 4 hours away and the harbor doing its indifferent thing in front of them. Take me back to Owen, she said. He moved toward the car. What? The drive north was quieter than the drive south had been. There was nothing left to plan, and the silence between them had changed its quality. Less charged, less careful. Just two people in a car in the early morning with the specific exhaustion of people who have been through something and are now on the other side of it and have not yet figured out what the other side looks like. She slept for 40 minutes somewhere around Newburyport. She hadn't intended to. She woke up when the road changed texture, the highway giving way to the smaller routes north. And for the 2 seconds before full consciousness arrived, she didn't know where she was. And then she did, and she sat up and looked at the road and felt the night come back to her in the specific, sequential way that difficult nights return. Damien was watching the road. He had not slept. She doubted he had slept. You should have let me know, she said. The sentence came out without preamble because she'd apparently been working on it during the 40 minutes she wasn't consciously awake. When you found out about Owen 14 months ago, you should have told me. He was quiet. I understand why you didn't. I understand the reasoning. I'm saying it was wrong. She looked at his profile. He's my son, and he's yours. And that's not a decision one person makes, not which way. I know, he said. If you told me 14 months ago, we'd have had 14 months to figure out whatever this is, to let Owen know his father, to... She stopped. 14 months. I know. His hands moved on the wheel. I told myself it was for you, that it was protecting what you'd built, that bringing myself back into your life was... He stopped. It was partly that. It was partly that I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to walk up to your door after 8 years and say, I know what you were told. I know what you believed. I know you built a life entirely without me, and I don't want to dismantle it. I just want to tell you that I'm here and that I've always been here and that the thing you were told happened was a lie. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't have the language for it. She looked at the road. You could have knocked on the window sooner than 6 weeks, she said. Yes. Instead of waiting for me to come to you. Yes. She looked at her hands in her lap. That's something we'll need to talk about. The way you make decisions about things that belong to both of us. Unilaterally. I know. Not tonight, she said, but soon. All right. They drove. The mountains came up on the right, losing the last of their color in the October gray. Damien? Yeah. The organization, she said. What comes after this? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I've been thinking about that for 2 years, since I understood what Calder had done, what it cost, what the whole structure costs. His voice was careful, precise in the way of someone who has rehearsed an idea enough times that it's become real. There are parts of it that are legitimate, The property holdings, 3 logistics companies, 2 construction firms, clean. They've been clean for years because I made them clean because I was tired of the other kind. He paused. The rest, the operational side. I've been building toward a handoff. People who want to run it and will run it without the escalation that brings Harwick Terminals into the equation. He glanced at her briefly. It takes time. Dismantling something like this without leaving a vacuum that fills with something worse takes time, and it takes coordination. But it's what I've been moving toward. She absorbed this. Is it real? She said. Or is it what you tell yourself to? It's real, he said. And the quality of the certainty in it. Not defensive, not performing, just the flat weight of a statement that had been tested privately for a long time, made her believe it. All right, she said. All right, he said. Gotten. They pulled up to the compound at 9:40 a.m., and Owen came out the front door before the car had fully stopped, which told her Parrish had been watching the monitor and had said something, and she got out and Owen hit her at the hip the same way he always did, all knees and momentum. And she caught him and held on and breathed him in. He smelled like the pine soap from the compound bathroom and cereal and himself. You came back, he said into her shoulder. I told you I would. I know, I still wasn't completely sure. He pulled back and looked at her face with the diagnostic attention he'd always applied to reading her. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. He looked at Damien, who had come around the car and stopped a few feet away, and the look he gave Damien was a different calculation, the specific, undefended appraisal of a child who has spent a night deciding something. You're bleeding, Owen said to him. Damien touched the dried cut above his eyebrow. It's nothing. Parrish has a first aid kit, Owen said. He showed me where it is. He considered. I can get it if you want. Something moved through Damien's face. All right, he said. Owen went back inside. Damien looked at Noelle. He's going to get you a bandage, she said. I see that. Let him, she said. He looked at the door Owen had disappeared through. He nodded, once, the nod of a man accepting instructions he has no intention of arguing with. She made coffee in the compound kitchen while Owen sat at the table across from Damien and applied a butterfly bandage to the cut with the focused concentration of a 7-year-old performing a task he has decided to take seriously. Damien sat very still through this process. He looked like a man trying not to move in case movement broke something. Does it hurt? Owen asked. No. It looks like it hurts. It looked worse before. Owen smoothed the bandage down with his thumb, examined his work. Okay. He sat back. I have a question. Damien looked at him. My mom said we'd talk last night, but then you weren't back yet, so we're talking now. He said it with the matter-of-fact directness that Noelle had been watching in him for 7 years and recognizing always as something not from her. Are you my dad? The kitchen was very quiet. Noelle set down the coffee pot and didn't turn around. She gave them the moment. She had thought about this for the entire drive north, thought about how to structure it, what to say first, how to provide a framework for a 7-year-old. And she had understood somewhere around Newburyport that some things couldn't be framed in advance. You had to let them happen and trust that the people in the room had enough between them. Damien said, yes. Owen looked at the table, then at Damien, then at the table again, processing, in the visible, methodical way he processed things that mattered. Why didn't I know? He said. Because I wasn't around when you were born, and for a long time after. A pause. That's not your fault. It's not your mom's fault either. It's complicated in ways I'm going to explain better when you're older, but the short version is that someone lied to both of us, and we believed it, and it kept us apart for a long time. Owen considered this. Someone lied to you and Mom. Yes. And that's why you weren't here. Yes. Is the lying person going to lie anymore? No, Damien said. They're not. Owen nodded slowly. He had the particular expression of a child filing information for future processing, not finished with it, not resolved about it, but setting it somewhere accessible for when he had more context to apply. Do you know about dinosaurs? He said. A beat. Some, Damien said carefully. We can work on that, Owen said, and reached for his cereal bowl. Noelle turned around, she picked up her coffee cup, and looked at the two of them at the table and felt something that she didn't try to name, something that was not simple and was not without its damage and its carried weight, but which was also real and present and hers. She sat down. They spent one more night at the compound while Parrish confirmed the city was navigable and Stroud filed the last of the formal record. Noelle spoke to Linda by phone, a long call, full of silences where Linda was clearly working to accept things without the full context that would make them make sense, and which ended with Linda saying, in the voice she used when she had decided to trust without understanding, "Just come home, Noelle. Bring him home." She called Marco as well, after 1 o'clock when Owen was asleep. She hadn't planned to, but she had thought about Antonio Corlano going into the White Mountains on a lie, and about what it meant to be a father sent to do something by someone who had given you a false map of the territory, and she found the number through Damien, and she made the call. Marco answered on the second ring. "Ms. Mercer," he said, not warmly, not coldly, the way you answer a call from someone you owe a debt to that you'd prefer not to articulate. "Your son went in thinking he was helping a child," she said. "I know what he was told. I'm not calling about that." She looked at the compound wall. "Owen is going to be fine. His doctor is very good. I wanted you to know that because the story Calder told you started with my son's health, and I thought you should know how that story ends." A long silence. "I'm glad the boy is well," Marco said. His voice had the weight of a man saying the truest thing he was capable of saying in this particular moment. "I know you are," she said, and meant it. She hung up and sat in the quiet and thought about how the world she'd stumbled back into was full of people who had done real damage and were not, most of them, simply monsters, who were people who had made calculations and followed them to their conclusions and lived with what those conclusions produced. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't make the damage less. It just made the landscape more complicated than the version of it she'd been carrying for 8 years, the version where everything was simply dangerous and everyone in it was simply dangerous and the only safe thing was to be outside of it entirely. She had never been outside of it entirely. She understood that now. You didn't marry into something and then escape it by leaving. You just changed the way it touched you. Owen's cardiac marker was not a coincidence. It was the body carrying what history deposits, visible or not. You dealt with what you had. You moved forward from where you were. She went to bed and slept without dreaming. They drove back to Boston on a Thursday morning with pale sun on the highway and Owen in the back seat with a book about prehistoric ocean life that Parrish had produced from somewhere in the compound with the manner of a man who had been quietly paying attention. Owen read aloud from it at intervals, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had decided that the car was an appropriate venue for shared education. The Mosasaurus was technically not a dinosaur, he announced, somewhere around Gloucester. It was a marine reptile. People get that wrong all the time. "Do they?" Damien said from the front passenger seat. "All the time. It's very common." He turned a page. The Mosasaurus could grow to 14 meters. That's bigger than a school bus. That's significant. It's extremely significant. Owen looked up from the book and out the window at the passing landscape with the satisfied expression of a child who has found his footing in an unfamiliar situation and is now operating from a position of relative confidence. Then he went back to reading. Noelle watched the two of them from the back seat, the back of Damien's head, the way he had oriented himself slightly toward Owen's voice without making it obvious he was doing it, and Owen entirely unaware of being observed, just reading, just being exactly himself, exactly the child he'd always been, in a car on a highway in October with the life ahead of him rearranged in ways he was only beginning to process. She thought about the 11-minute walk, about the way she'd structured that walk into the architecture of normal. Keys, coat, cobblestone, home. The routine that had lied to her. She thought about 6 weeks of walking past a parked car without looking at it, and what it meant that she'd been able to do that, what kind of armor that represented, and what it had cost to maintain. She didn't want armor that comprehensive anymore. She wasn't sure she had the energy to maintain it, and she wasn't sure it had ever protected her from the right things. Linda was waiting at the apartment. Noelle had called ahead, and Linda had let herself in with the spare key. She did this sometimes when something was wrong, appearing in the kitchen with food she'd prepared as if nourishment was the primary response to crisis, which in Linda's framework, it essentially was. The apartment smelled like soup when they came up the stairs, and Owen went directly to the kitchen and lifted the pot lid and inhaled with the reverence of a child returning to a known good. Linda looked at Noelle, at Damien, whom she had never met and whose presence required no explanation that Noelle was going to provide immediately, at Owen lifting the pot lid, then at Noelle again. "You look terrible," Linda said. "Thank you," Noelle said. "Are you hurt?" "No." Linda's eyes moved to Damien, to the healed cut above his eyebrow, which Owen had bandaged with rather more tape than was strictly necessary, to the quality of stillness in him, the way he stood in a room, which was a specific way that Linda, sharp as she was, could probably categorize even without context. "You're the father," Linda said. A beat. "Yes," Damien said. Linda looked at him for a long moment with the full assessment of a woman who had spent 30 years watching children and the adults responsible for them, and had developed precise instruments for evaluating both. Whatever she was measuring, she measured it thoroughly. "Owen has a dentist appointment on the 14th, she said. "He needs to be reminded 3 times, or he'll pretend he forgot." Damien absorbed this. "I'll remember," he said. Linda nodded as if a contract had been executed and went back to the kitchen. "What's up?" 3 weeks passed in the way weeks pass after something large. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a kind of deliberate texture, each day pressing back against the ones before it. The ordinary details of an ordinary life reasserting themselves with the specific insistence of things that were always there and do not particularly care what happened to interrupt them. The restaurant opened the following Monday. Marco had come back from inventory knowing approximately nothing about what had occurred. She'd given him a version that was not untrue, but was edited, something about a personal family situation that had required her full attention, and Marco had accepted this the way people accept explanations from managers they trust. Not by believing every word of it, but by believing enough of it to move forward. The lunch service was slow, the way it always was on a cold Monday in October. She stood behind the bar and watched the dining room and felt the specific pleasure of a space that was hers, fully, legally, documentably hers, in a way she had always believed it to be, but which had been, she now knew, not entirely true. The truth made it better. It was hers the way things are yours when the paperwork catches up to the fact. Damien came in at 7 the first night, at the dinner rush. He came through the front door, not a parked car. Owen was not with him. Owen was at Linda's for the weeknight, as was his pattern. But Noelle saw him come through the door and saw Marco look at her with the expression of a man filing information for later, and she crossed the dining room and said, "We're full." "I have a reservation," he said. "Under what name?" "Vescari." She looked at the reservation book. His name was in it, in Marco's handwriting, which told her that Marco had been informed of something and had decided to be useful about it. She looked up. "Table by the window," she said. He followed her to the table. She set the menu in front of him and he didn't open it. "I'm going to need a recommendation," he said. "The branzino," she said. "It's what we do well." "Then that." She went back to the floor. She could feel him in the room the way you feel something you've been aware of for a long time, the way you feel the shape of a missing thing when it's present. She did not stand at his table, and she did not ignore the rest of her service, and she did not do anything other than run her restaurant the way she ran it every night, with the forward-moving, total attention of a woman who had built something and knew what it was worth. He left a good tip. He came back the next night. On a Saturday in November, Noelle picked Owen up from his friend Marcus's house, and they walked home along the harbor in the cold, Owen's hand in hers, both of them in coats that were slightly insufficient for the actual temperature because neither of them was willing to concede that it was genuinely winter yet. "Marcus says I can come for Thanksgiving," Owen said. "We'll see." "That means maybe." "That means we'll see." He swung her hand once, a childhood habit, the pendulum swing that meant he was content and comfortable and in possession of enough energy that it was expressing itself physically. "Is Damien coming to Thanksgiving?" She had not expected this question at this exact moment. She should have. What made you think of that? He's been at the restaurant a lot. Owen said this neutrally, as information rather than assessment. Marcus's dad comes to dinner all the time. That's just something dads do. He considered. I told Marcus I might have a dad now. He said that was cool. He said his dad was pretty cool once you got used to him. She looked at the harbor, at the lights coming on across the water as the afternoon darkened, at the specific way the harbor looked at this hour on this stretch of the waterfront. The lights doubled in the water, everything slightly uncertain in the dusk. We're figuring it out, she said. That's fine, Owen said. I'm not in a hurry. He swung her hand again. I just want to know if I should warn him about Marcus's dog. It's really big and it jumps. Some people don't like that. She looked down at him, at the gap-tooth profile, the hair that always needed cutting, the absolute self-possession of a child who had been through 3 days of genuine danger and had emerged from it with his fundamental nature entirely intact. I'll warn him about the dog, she said. Owen nodded, satisfied, and they walked the rest of the way home. On a Tuesday night, 6 weeks after the Harwick terminal, Noelle closed the restaurant alone. Marco had left at 11:30, the busboy at 11:45, and she stood behind the bar in the quiet the way she always had, counting the till, listening to the building settle, smelling the end of a long day in the grain of the floor and the tables. She turned off the kitchen lights, turned off the dining room lights, stood at the window for a moment, and looked out at Brant Street. The street was empty. No parked sedan, no shape behind dark glass. She put her coat on and took the deposit bag and went out the front door and locked it behind her and stood on the sidewalk in the cold. Damien was leaning against the building 6 feet away, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the harbor. He turned when he heard the door. The walk's 11 minutes, she said. I know, he said. You've been timing it from the car for 6 weeks. Longer than that, he said. A pause. If that's all right. She considered him. The coat, the cut above his eyebrow, fully healed now to a thin, pale line. The quality of stillness that she had spent years trying to forget, and had, she was understanding, never actually managed to. It's all right, she said, but you're walking it with me. He fell into step beside her. The cobblestones were cold and damp, and the harbor was doing its thing. The cold, the indifference, the lights reflected and broken on the water. Their footsteps made the sound of seconds being counted. The restaurant fell behind them. The street opened out toward the waterfront and then turned north toward her building. 11 minutes. She didn't fill them with words. Neither did he. There was a specific kind of silence that exists between people who have run out of necessary things to say and are resting in what's left. And this was that kind. Not comfortable exactly. Not yet, maybe not for a long time, but real. Present, not performed. At some point, not quite halfway, his hand found hers. Not a gesture, just a fact. The way something falls into place after being out of place long enough that you've forgotten the shape of the original. She held on. They walked. The harbor lights moved on the water. The street ran ahead of them, familiar and ordinary and entirely different from what it had been a month ago, 2 months ago, 8 years ago, on all the nights she had walked it alone and told herself that alone was sufficient and believed it just enough to keep going. Sufficient was one thing. This was something else. She didn't try to name it. Some things were better approached obliquely, lived into rather than defined. You let them exist in the periphery until they were familiar enough to look at directly, and you did not rush that process because rushing it was how you got the shape of it wrong. Her building came into view at the end of the block. She could see the light Linda had left on in the hallway. Linda always left the hallway light on when Owen was with her, a signal that required no explanation between them. They stopped at the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. The night was cold, and the harbor was making its harbor sounds behind them, and the light above the door was a yellow square in the dark. And she thought about a phone call 8 years ago that had cost them everything, and a man in a car who had spent 6 weeks making sure she got home safely instead of knocking on a window, and a 7-year-old who had held himself together in a dark room during something terrible and then asked for cereal and applied a bandage with excessive tape and decided, with the pragmatic generosity that was entirely his own, that he could work with what he'd been given. "Come to dinner Sunday," she said. "Owen wants to warn you about a dog." Something moved through Damien's face, slow, real, the thing underneath all the controlled surfaces finally arriving at the light. "All right," he said. She went inside. He stood on the sidewalk and watched the door close, and then he stood there a moment longer in the cold with his hands in his pockets and the harbor behind him, and then he turned and walked back the way they'd come. Not hurrying, not disappearing into a car, just a man on a street in the dark, not waiting anymore. Moving. Tide and Salt opened every day at 11 and closed when the last table was done. The Bronzino remained the best thing on the menu. Owen started his cardiac medication on a Wednesday and announced it tasted like chalk, which Dr. Reinhold had apparently predicted with complete accuracy. He took it every morning without further complaint because his mother took her own medication in front of him every morning without complaint, and he had always been a child who learned best by observation. He and Damien talked about dinosaurs, then about other things, then about things Owen brought to him specifically, questions that had been waiting for the right person to receive them, the way certain questions wait. It was not easy. It was not a thing that resolved cleanly or arrived at a stable state quickly. There were nights Noelle sat in the dark of her kitchen after Owen was asleep and felt the weight of the accumulated years. What they'd cost, what they'd taken, what could not be recovered simply by understanding why it happened. Understanding the cause of a wound did not close it. It just changed the character of the healing. She did not rush it. She ran her restaurant, and she raised her son, and she walked home through the cold, and she let what was building build at its own pace, because she had spent 8 years forcing pace and momentum as substitutes for resolution, and she was finished with that. The harbor was still there every night. The lights still moved on the water. The street still ran 11 minutes from the restaurant to her door. Some nights Damien walked it with her. Some nights she walked it alone. Both were fine. Both were hers. That was the thing about building something real. It didn't require constant witness. It just required that you kept showing up to it, kept doing the work of it, kept choosing it in the small daily ways that don't feel like choices because they're so embedded in the texture of a life that they become the life itself. She kept showing up. That was enough. That had always been enough. That was what the quiet figure outside had been waiting to see. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not the restoration of what had been lost. Just this. Her still here. Owen still here. The restaurant with its lights on and its harbor view and its smell of garlic butter and old wood still here. Still open.